Before she died, the former Graceland maid, who spent a decade inside Elvis Presley's private world, finally broke her silence. And what she revealed is sending shockwaves through fans everywhere. For years, Nancy Rooks kept quiet. No interviews, no drama. But in her final months, she spoke up for the first time. And what she said about Elvis's final hours doesn't match the story we've all been told. Was the king of rock and roll hiding something behind those Graceland walls? This isn't just a rumor. It's a first-hand account from someone who was there. And her confession changes everything. The woman behind the mansion walls. Before the tours, the velvet ropes, and the gift shops, Graceland was just a house. Lived in, messy, vibrant. And in the heart of that house was a woman few outside the Presley circle knew by name, Nancy Rooks. She didn't wear rhinestones, didn't sing a note, and never appeared in a tabloid. But for 10 pivotal years, from 1967 until Elvis's death in 1977, and even beyond that, Nancy was part of the private life the public never got to see. She wasn't hired through celebrity connections or Hollywood favors. Nancy came into Graceland by chance, a temporary placement through an agency, a one-time assignment to help out while someone else was sick. But Vernon Presley noticed something in her work ethic, her calm presence, and asked her to stay. What began as a one-time favor turned into a full-time position inside one of the most famous homes in America. At first, she was just supposed to clean, but that quickly expanded. Nancy became Elvis' cook, often preparing his favorite down-home southern dishes. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches, fried pickles, meatloaf and cornbread. She made it all, usually around midnight, because Elvis didn't live on anyone else's schedule. He'd wake late, eat late, and party even later. And Nancy adjusted her life to fit that rhythm. Her shift usually started around 5:00 p.m. with breakfast for Elvis and ran past midnight. That's when Elvis would come down barefoot or in slippers, hair still messy, smiling or silent, depending on his mood. But she didn't just feed the man. She saw him, not the king, not the icon, the man. The version of Elvis Presley who lounged around in robes, who had random cravings, who asked simple things like, "Got any peach cobbler?" The version who sometimes wanted company and sometimes wanted to be left alone. Nancy was one of the few who understood the difference, and maybe that's why he trusted her. She saw the parade of guests that came through. Celebrities, bodyguards, girlfriends, friends from the old neighborhood. She saw how many people tried to please him, how many depended on him. But she also saw how tired he sometimes looked when the crowd was gone. There were nights when the house was oddly quiet, and he'd ask her to sing a hymn with him and Minnie May, his grandmother. Not perform, just sing quietly in the kitchen. Nancy didn't gossip. She didn't sell stories. Even when others cashed in on the Presley name, she stayed silent. When fans wrote letters asking what he was really like, she answered with kindness, but never crossed the line. He was kind, she'd say. He was funny. He was generous. And that was usually all. Years later, when she did decide to share more, it was through her own words in books like The Maid, The Man, and The Fans and Inside Graceland. Even then, the stories were told with dignity and restraint. They weren't exposes. They were glimpses told by someone who had nothing to gain by embellishing. Rooks offered detailed accounts of daily routines, personal moments, and even the day of Elvis' passing, all conveyed with a respectful, affectionate tone. Her writings are valued for their authenticity and heartfelt portrayal of life with Elvis, offering fans cherished insights into the man behind the legend. But even in those books, there were things she didn't say. Things she held back, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear they'd be misunderstood, perhaps because some truths are heavier when spoken aloud. Nancy Rooks was never on stage, never in the spotlight. But she was in the room, on the stairs, in the kitchen, in the hallway, just a few feet away from history every single day. And as time passed and the myth of Elvis grew larger, her memories stayed tucked away, quieter than the loud rumors and documentaries. Until near the end of her life, she decided to open that door just slightly and finally say something the world never expected to hear. The final days at Graceland. In the summer of 1977, the mood inside Graceland had shifted. There were still flashes of laughter and late-night music, but something underneath it all felt different. The energy was thinner, more strained. Elvis wasn't the same, not entirely. He was heavier, quieter, more withdrawn, and sometimes visibly in pain. But he was also still trying, still moving. He had tour dates on the calendar, plans to get back on the road. People often forget that he was preparing to leave again. Nancy Rooks noticed the small things, the way he'd sit down a little slower, the way his appetite flickered in and out. Some nights, he'd ask for full meals. Other nights, he only wanted water or juice. The bathroom upstairs had become a sort of private sanctuary for him. No one disturbed him there unless absolutely necessary. But even so, the staff noticed how long he'd stay inside. It wasn't just about privacy. It was where he'd go to be alone, out of reach. Elvis had always had peculiar habits. His sleep cycle was famously upside down. He'd be up at 3:00 a.m., watching TV or playing racquetball, then asleep when the sun rose. Nancy's schedule adapted to that rhythm. She'd often find herself making breakfast at midnight or preparing dinner when most people were pouring their morning coffee. But in those final days, things became even more unpredictable. He was restless. One moment, joking with a friend, the next pacing through the halls deep in thought, as if something was pulling at him. The day before he died, Elvis played racquetball at the Graceland court. That detail has been repeated so many times, it's become part of the official timeline. But what's less often mentioned is how normal that day seemed to everyone inside the house. He wasn't bedridden. He wasn't unconscious. He was active, moving, laughing, sweating from the game, talking with bodyguards, in and out of the kitchen. It didn't look like the day before a death. And maybe that's why it hit so hard. Nancy remembered the early morning hours of August 16th. He had just returned from racquetball, standing on the steps outside the kitchen, tired but alert. She offered him breakfast like she always did. "You want something to eat, Mr. Elvis?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I don't want anything to eat now. I just want to get some sleep. But what I would like to have is some water." That's when she asked Pauline to bring him some, in the kind of plastic jug you'd normally use for orange juice, the kind with a grip on the side. It was a small moment, simple, but Pauline too remembered it. How Elvis grabbed the water and drank it like he hadn't in months. Fast, like a man parched. "I ain't never knowed him to grab that water and drink it like he drank it this morning," Pauline said. Nancy had brushed it off at the time. "He's probably just tired," she told her. "He's been playing racquetball. He's hot." But now, in hindsight, that moment glows with eerie clarity, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary, because it was the last exchange, the last act of care from someone who had looked after him for years. He didn't ask for anything extravagant. He didn't make a big speech. He just wanted water. And then he went upstairs. Later that morning, Ginger Alden found him in the bathroom, unresponsive. The house turned silent. Chaos followed, paramedics, screams, confusion. But for Nancy, the loudest sound was something quieter, the echo of a simple request from a man who seemed, for just a moment, like he was going to be okay. What she refused to say, until now. For decades after Elvis Presley's death, Nancy Rooks remained one of the most respected but least outspoken voices from inside Graceland. While many others cashed in on their connection to the king, former friends, ex-girlfriends, even distant relatives, Nancy stayed largely silent. Not because she didn't have stories, she had more than most, but she carried them like delicate glass. Some things, she believed, just weren't meant for public consumption. Not yet. In the years that followed, Nancy gave a few interviews. She wrote books. But even in those moments, she was careful. She never sensationalized. She never made Elvis a joke or a martyr. She kept the line between public memory and private reality sharp. Her books, like Inside Graceland, offered glimpses of the man behind the image, but always with dignity, always with restraint, always with restraint. Readers walked away with warm memories, not gossip. She had nothing to prove, no debts to settle, no score to even. But behind closed doors, there were things Nancy never put in writing, things she never shared on television, observations that gnawed at her, patterns that didn't make sense, comments Elvis made that she couldn't forget. And over time, the weight of those details began to change shape, not because she suddenly wanted fame, but because she began to feel time pressing in, because she realized no one else who was really there was going to speak up. In her final years, Nancy grew more reflective. Friends said she would occasionally hint at things people didn't know about Elvis. She never said it with bitterness, only with a kind of quiet urgency. She started to mention the pills more openly, how many there were, how often he took them, not recklessly but systematically, how even though Elvis had doctors around him, it didn't always feel like he was being helped. It felt like he was being managed. Nancy never said Elvis wanted to die. In fact, she insisted he didn't. But she believed something important had been misunderstood. He wasn't gone, she told a friend once. He was tired, he was worn down, but he was still in there, still trying. The turning point came when she was asked casually during a small gathering if there was anything she ever wished she had said publicly about Elvis. Nancy paused, then said softly, "I don't think he died the way they said he did. Not really. It wasn't a conspiracy theory." She wasn't suggesting a cover-up or a faked death, but she was suggesting something deeper, that the story people had been fed for decades, that Elvis simply collapsed from drugs and poor health, missed something, that it flattened the complexity of a man who had been struggling, yes, but who was also making plans, who was thinking of getting clean, who had only days before spoken about starting over. Quietly, privately, somewhere far from Graceland. These weren't things Nancy had ever said publicly, but in the months before her death, she began to open up. One listener described it as a quiet release, like she had been holding her breath for 45 years, and now she could finally exhale. She never tried to rewrite history, but what she did do, gently, respectfully, was offer another layer, a final piece of the puzzle, a whisper in the margins of a story the world thought it already knew. And what she said next, in her own words, would shift how we remember Elvis Presley's final hours forever. What did Nancy say before her death? It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't even meant for the world at large. But in a small recorded conversation, just months before her passing, Nancy Rooks, Elvis Presley's longtime maid, cook, and trusted witness, finally said what she had never dared to say before. With age softening her voice, but sharpening her memory, she spoke with startling clarity. Elvis was not what people think. He was not some lost man waiting to die. And he didn't die the way they told you all he did. For decades, Nancy had answered questions with grace, never stirring the pot. She was known as the quiet one, the loyal one. But this time something shifted. Maybe it was the nearness of her own mortality. Maybe it was the fact that she had outlived so many of the others. Or maybe, as she put it herself, it's just time. She began by describing that last morning again, only this time with more weight behind the words. He didn't say much. Just asked for water. Not food, just water. But he drank it like he hadn't had anything in days. That stuck with me, she said. He was tired, sure, but there was a look in his eyes that morning, like he was trying to reset, not give up. And then came the line that turned the room still. I always said he was sick. But I'm telling you now, Elvis was not ready to die. Those around her leaned in, unsure if they were hearing her right. But she continued, slower now. He was talking about getting away, not from people, from the noise, from being Elvis. He told me once, just a week or so before he passed, I wish I could just be a man again, just a man somewhere quiet. That's not something you say if you've given up. Nancy also pointed to something most people missed, the stash of books Elvis kept upstairs, many of them on spirituality, health, even personal transformation. He was looking for answers, she said, not in pills, Not anymore. He was starting to notice how much of him had been managed, controlled. She didn't pretend he wasn't struggling. Oh, he was in pain, she admitted. He had been hurt by people he trusted. He was in and out of sleep. He was bloated. He had all those meds. I'm not saying he was fine, but I am saying he was trying. That matters. Her words weren't loud, but they were steady. They say he overdosed. But I think he was exhausted, not just physically, spiritually, and that makes a difference. He wasn't reckless that morning. He wasn't high. He just wanted sleep. She shared one more memory, something she'd never told anyone before. A few days before he passed, he asked me if I believed people could start over. I said, sure, if they want to. And he said, maybe I will. Maybe one day I'll wake up and leave all this, just disappear. He smiled, like he was half joking, but part of me wonders if he meant it. Those who heard her speak that day say her tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bitter. It was just final. A closing chapter from someone who had cleaned his sheets, folded his shirts, cooked his midnight meals, and stood in silence the day he died. Before she died, former Graceland maid Nancy Rooks finally broke her silence on Elvis Presley, and what she said didn't rewrite history. It reframed it. Elvis wasn't a king who crumbled. He was a man trying to stand back up. And maybe, just maybe, he almost did what she thought happened to Elvis. But maybe, just maybe, he never really left. In the years after Elvis's death, Nancy Rooks stayed on at Graceland, often working the night shift long after the tours ended and the house fell silent, or at least it seemed silent. In one rare interview, Nancy shared something few expected, and that she had never told before. She believed Elvis's spirit was still around. Yeah, well, it were, she said matter-of-factly. I would be down in the trophy room and the lights and things would flash on and off when I would be cleaning, 'cause I worked at night. I would tell Mr. Elvis, now you leave these lights alone, 'cause I got to see. She wasn't trying to be spooky, that wasn't her style. She was simply telling what she experienced, and she wasn't the only one. Over the years, other staff had similar stories, but Nancy stood out because of how naturally she spoke about it, like she was just talking about a stubborn boss still keeping tabs on his home. One night, she recalled, I was laying down on the platform where his uniforms, his suits, they had in the middle there in the trophy room on exhibit. I was laying down. I tried to sleep and take me a nap, and somebody shook my foot. I said, what is this? I jumped up. I didn't see anybody. I said, Mr. Elvis, I know what you did. You did that to wake me up. She laughed, remembering. That mean for me to go to work, so I gets on up and hurry up and get out of here. Now, to Nancy, this wasn't frightening. It was familiar. It was Elvis being Elvis, playful, present, impossible to ignore. She wasn't chasing myths. She wasn't saying he faked his death. She was saying something quieter, something stranger, that maybe he hadn't fully left. Not the house, not the people who loved him, not the place he once called home. He loved that house, she said. He loved us. I don't think he wanted to go, not fully, and maybe in some quiet way he didn't. The reaction nobody expected. When word began to spread about Nancy Rooks' final testimony, it didn't make front-page news. There were no breaking headlines, no viral frenzy. It started as a quiet ripple, shared among Elvis forums, whispered at fan conventions, passed between collectors and die-hard Presley followers. But those who paid attention knew immediately this was different. This wasn't just another rehashing of old rumors. This came from someone who had lived in the house, someone who had been there in the moment, someone who had never once sought the spotlight. And now, after nearly half a century, she had finally spoken up. At first, the reaction was mixed. Some fans were moved to tears. They read her words and felt, maybe for the first time, that they understood Elvis, not as a distant icon but as a man, fragile, complicated, and trying. One woman wrote in a fan group, Nancy's words changed everything for me. I used to think Elvis gave up. Now I think he was just tired of carrying everyone else's expectations. Others were skeptical. They questioned the timing. Why now? Why not say something sooner? But even the skeptics couldn't deny that Nancy had nothing to gain. She hadn't packaged her memories for profit. She hadn't sought a documentary deal. She had simply spoken and passed away not long after. Her message left hanging in the air like unfinished lyrics to a song only she knew how to sing. Among Elvis scholars and biographers, her statement stirred a quieter kind of reckoning. For decades, the dominant narrative had been simple. Elvis spiraled. Elvis overdosed. Elvis died too young because he couldn't escape the trap of fame. But Nancy's version didn't contradict the facts, it reframed them. Instead of painting him as reckless, she suggested he was worn down, yes, but intentional. That he was considering real change. That he hadn't let go of life, he had just been overwhelmed by it. Some commentators picked up on this nuance. A few smaller publications ran features with titles like, "Was Elvis planning a comeback the world never saw?" or "The housekeeper who knew the king best." But mainstream media mostly kept their distance. After all, this wasn't a scandal. It wasn't marketable in the usual way. There were no accusations, no lawsuits, no shocking new evidence, just a woman's voice, calm and unwavering, offering an alternate ending to a story the world thought it had already closed. Inside the Elvis fan community, however, Nancy's words sparked renewed interest in his final months. Fans began re-watching old interviews, digging up outtakes from his last performances, looking for signs, clues that maybe, just maybe, he was planning something beyond Graceland. Discussions shifted from how did he die to what was he trying to do before he died. And that shift mattered. It allowed room for hope, for the idea that Elvis wasn't just fading, he was fighting. And then there were those who had known Nancy personally, former staff, distant relatives, friends of the Presley family. Many of them confirmed that she had always been careful with her words. She never said anything unless she meant it. One former co-worker said, "So if Nancy said Elvis wasn't ready to go, then I believe her." In the end, her confession didn't spark controversy, it sparked compassion. It reminded people that legends aren't built in a day, and they don't crumble in one either. Nancy's quiet truth wasn't explosive, it was human. It allowed Elvis to be remembered not as a man defeated by fame, but as someone who, even in his final hours, was reaching for something better. And in that simple act, breaking her silence before her own death, Nancy Rooks gave Elvis something he rarely got in life: understanding. What we still don't know, for everything Nancy Rooks shared before she passed, there's still so much she took with her. That's the nature of stories that live behind closed doors. They're shaped as much by what's said as by what isn't. Graceland has since become a museum, a monument, a frozen version of Elvis' world, carefully curated for the public. But the real Graceland, the one that buzzed with late-night laughter, whispered conversations, and quiet moments like the one Nancy described, only existed for a few who truly lived in it. And most of them, like Nancy, are now gone. Her final words didn't solve a mystery, they deepened it. Because if Elvis really was thinking of starting over, of walking away from the spotlight, then what stopped him? Was it too late physically? Was he simply surrounded by too many people with too many agendas? Or did he, in the end, believe that there was no version of himself the world would ever accept that didn't come with the crown? There are still questions. Was there a conversation no one heard? A phone call never made? Was there someone he meant to talk to that night? Nancy's testimony suggests a man still halfway between decision and action. But the truth, it likely died with him. What remains is this: a woman who saw everything, who said nothing for nearly 45 years, finally chose to speak. And what she offered wasn't scandal or spectacle, it was clarity. Elvis, in her eyes, wasn't some broken icon. He was human, flawed, burdened, but not beyond hope. Maybe that's the legacy she wanted to leave behind, not a correction, but a reminder that even legends carry quiet dreams of escape. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told not by the loudest voices, but by those who waited until the world was finally ready to hear them. If Elvis truly was planning to start over, to leave behind the weight of his fame and just be a man again, what stopped him? And more importantly, what would the world look like if he had lived to tell his own?